Hello, hello. Today we are going to be going over the second half of the herps. So we did the reptiles last week. Now, along with our move into the wetlands away from the prairies, we're also going to be talking about the amphibians. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Just a general reminder, up next week, you have your first species quiz. And so what this means is you need to be studying the am I doing this right? There we go. Sorry. You need to be studying the species that we've talked about in lecture. So studying the common names, the scientific names, the photographs, as well as it's a good idea to look up other photographs on the internet so you get an idea of the variation, as well as the sounds. So of course that's only true for the bird calls and then the frog calls we're going to go through today. So those are going to be on the quiz also. So get familiar with listening and with identifying those field marks. Okay, so the amphibians of Chicago. So again, just to orient us, we talked about the herps are the reptiles plus the amphibians. But remember how different amphibians truly are from those reptiles. So here I'm showing you a different tree. It's similar to the one we looked at last week, but it shows the same things, but in a different format. So now we're looking at time moving downwards instead of to the left, right? So this is the most ancestral back here. And these are just kind of artfully displayed. But we've got the reptiles here, this big group, which includes the birds. We've got mammals and this other group of extinct animals, the mammal-like reptiles. And then all the way outside of those, outside of the amniotes, we've got the amphibians. And so that's where we are today. So the herps, again, it's this kind of random grouping of amphibians plus reptiles without birds, right? So that's why it's not really a taxonomic name. It's just a common name that's easy to use. So we're going to be focusing in on these amphibians. So the amphibians are made up of three main groups: the caecilians, the anurans, and the urodels. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, I've never heard of any of those. But you have, I promise. The caecilians are probably the only one you haven't heard of. And these guys are incredibly rare. I've never seen one. I don't even see them in zoos. I'm sure that there are some zoos that have them. But caecilians are completely fossorial, which means they live underground. And they look like earthworms, only they have bones. So they're kind of a mix between a snake and an earthworm. And I highly suggest you Google these just to see what they look like, because they're really kind of cool and weird. And there's some bright blue ones. And I think they just recently found the first caecilian with venom, which is it's never going to be able to harm a human, but really fascinating and understudied, not well understood group of animals. Those are not ones we're going to be talking any more about today. The other two groups, the anurans and the urodels, you've definitely heard of. So let's break down what those words mean. So an, the A and the AN means without, and ura, U-R-A, is referring to tails. So these are amphibians without tails. Any guesses what those are? The frogs and toads, exactly. So anurans are frogs and toads. And then the urodels are the ones with tails. Those are the salamanders, or the salamanders and newts, all of which are types of salamanders. So the reason all of these three groups of organisms are called amphibians is because they inhabit both land and water. So amphi means both, they're in both land and water. Water is essential to their life cycle because they are not amniotes. Now, if you remember from Bio 202 what an amniote is, those are the animals that have an amnion within the egg sac, and the amnion provides nutrients and provides protection from the environment and keeps the embryo from drying out. Amphibians do not have amnions, and so they have to lay their eggs in the water. So they're intimately tied to water as a part of their life cycle, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Another thing that's pretty unique about amphibians is that they have what's called cutaneous respiration. Cutaneous means skin, so this is talking about their skin. So they can actually breathe through their skin. So they have pores all over with blood vessels that come really close to the skin so that they can exchange gas that way. What this means is that when you're handling an amphibian, and I mentioned this briefly in the herping video, You need to be really careful to do it quickly, do it with only clean hands, and make sure that you keep the amphibian wet. Without that water, gas exchange can't occur. It helps diffuse the gas. So if their skin dries out, they can die very easily. So in most cases, it's better to not handle amphibians at all, but if you must, keep your hands moist and clean, and keep the animal moist. Because of both of these things, not only do they live in land and water, but they also use gas exchange through their skin, they are very prone to contaminants in the environment. For this reason, frogs and now salamanders in some places are starting to be used as species that can tell us about the quality of the water, where if they exist in certain areas, or if certain species exist in areas, we know that that water must be very clean and clear in order for the animals to be there. All right, so I mentioned their life cycles a little bit, and you may be familiar with these already, but I just want to go through it so we're all on the same page. So the frog, we have the anurin life cycle here on the left, or frogs. I'll probably just call them frogs. That's an easier word to say, but no, I'm talking about frogs and toads, everything in that anurin group. And then we have the urodel life cycle here. So in both cases, they're laying these eggs. These eggs look kind of like little eyeballs, right? But mostly we have the embryo in the middle of this like jelly sac that's kept them, that keeps them wet. These are always in water or in really wet environments. So in the rainforest, you sometimes get them on leaves and such, but they're still really near water. And that's because what hatches out of them are these larvae that have gills. So they are fully aquatic. So you may have seen these before. Some people call them polywogs, some people call them tadpoles. I tend to call them tadpoles, but these are the larval form of frogs. So they have these wide flattened tails, little bodies. They're also covered in a mucus layer, so if you ever felt them, they feel really slimy, and that's to help with gas exchange. And then they kind of sprout legs, like literally sprout legs through the back and the front. They start losing their tail. We call these toadlets or froglets a lot, when they still have a tail, but they have all their limbs. And then they move to full-on terrestrial, a terrestrial environment. On this side, we have this adult salamander or newt or whatever, laid its egg or eggs. They're also in bunches. You have the larvae that emerge. These look a little bit different, right? So we see the first thing you might notice is that they have limbs pretty early on, or at least 4 limbs. They have hind limb buds coming in. But they also have these feathery structures on the sides of the head, and these are their gills. These are called external gills. So this helps with gas exchange also. So all those little fingers increases the surface area to volume ratio so they can better exchange gas in the water. They grow bigger and start losing the tail, and then eventually move on land. They lose the external gills, they develop lungs, and their tails become less thinned and more flattened. A really cool thing about this amphibian life cycle is that for a lot of species, and a lot of the ones we're going to be talking about today, they're what's called explosive breeders. And what that means is they have concentrated breeding seasons, sometimes just a period of a couple days, that involve mass movement of the animals to ponds. So this happens in the spring for all amphibians in North America that I can think of, or definitely in Chicagoland. All the amphibians do this in the early spring. Most of them are explosive breeders. Some of them have longer, more drawn out breeding seasons. But with the explosive breeders, these are the cases where you see lots of frogs and toads and salamanders crossing the roads at night. You may have seen that if you're in a more rural part of Illinois. They all go into these vernal pools that are formed in the forest as a result of melting snow that are only there for a really brief amount of time. This is a really great time to study them. And in fact, I have a link here to the frog call survey that's run by the Peggy Notebart Museum of Natural History. So they've had a survey that goes out every year. They train volunteers in how to go to these ponds and listen to the frog calls to ID which species are there. And this is a really great way to keep track of conservation of these species in the wild. So I encourage anyone who's interested. The Peggy Notebart does training. I'm not sure what they're doing this year with COVID, but definitely worth checking out, something that you might be interested in doing in the winter and spring. So I mentioned they're listening for frog calls to ID them so they don't have to actually mess with the ponds that are full of them. That's because all these males and females travel from really far distances to these little pools, and then males call, and that attracts the female. So if you hear a frog calling, you're always hearing a male, right? When we talked about the birds, if you hear a song, it's almost always the male, but either sex can chirp and make other noises. With the frogs, it's any call that you're hearing at night, especially, is a male. The males are the ones doing the calling. Females can do little small vocalizations that I only know about from handling them. So they're not ever going to do this. Females aren't going to just be calling at all. But you might like hear a squeak or two if you're picking one up, for instance. Okay, so check out the Peggy Notabart if you're interested in participating in these frog surveys. So without further ado, let's dive in to the species that you are likely to see here in Chicagoland. Now again, because of this explosive breeding, it's much easier to see amphibians in the spring than it is right now when it's just starting to get cold and it's already really, it's been really dry for a while. Now we're getting rain this week, but these are harder to see, but I'll tell you which ones we're likely to see when we go on our field experiences, including this one. This is the green frog. This is one of the most common species we have around here. They're often in water, but you can also find them sometimes in fields or in the middle of nowhere as they move between bodies of water. It's the green frog, Lithobates clamitans. One nice thing about the amphibians we're going to be talking about today is that we have a limited number of genera. Genera is the plural word for genus. So most of the species we're talking about are within a few genuses or genera. So you only have to memorize a few of those, but make sure you keep the species name straight. So this is Lithobates clamitans. Now I'm pointing out a couple things here that are going to be really important for distinguishing the green frog from the next species we talk about, which is the bullfrog. The main thing that you'll use to distinguish those two is this line called the dorsolateral fold. Green frogs have it, bullfrogs do not. Bullfrogs get much bigger, but unless you're looking at a really huge frog, and with a green frog next to it, relative size doesn't help too much. So always check for this dorsolateral fold that'll tell you if this is a green frog. Notice it goes down from the eye all the way down the back. The other part of a frog that I just want to point out is this circle that's behind the eye. This is called the tympanum, and it's the external eardrum. So behind that, you have all the inner ear parts. So lots of people just wonder what that circle is. I just wanted to point out that is the external eardrum or the tympanum. All right, so green frogs are usually going to be green, yellow, or brown. They don't really have any obvious patterns, though they can. And then you're going to look for that fold. So let's compare that. Let's listen to the sound the green frog makes first. So this one sounds kind of like a rubber band snapping on a weird banjo, right? It's very twangy. And here's the call, another part of the call. You hear the same twang, but it's kind of in a different a more rounded noise. All right, that's really easily distinguishable from the bullfrog, which I'll play right now while the green frog's still fresh in your head. Here's what the bullfrog calls sound like.
American bull.
Really deep, really guttural, none of that twang. Right? And that's where they get their name, the bullfrog, because it is a deep kind of guttural call. So if you're not hearing the frog call, you need to look for that dorsolateral ridge. So notice here on this bullfrog, there is not a ridge. They're really similar colors, right? Like no, quit playing. Sorry about that. They're really similar colors here, so you can't really use the colors to distinguish them. You have to just use that dorsolateral ridge or their call, if you're lucky enough to hear their call. The bullfrog is Lithobates catesbiensis. These are native here, but they're invasive over much of the rest of the world. Because bullfrogs get so big, and we're talking like that big, like big chonky guys, they often outcompete other native frog species. So especially California right now is struggling with invasive bullfrogs that are killing off a lot of the native species. And they've been doing some strong invasive species management. But this is just something to be aware of, is they are native here, so bullfrogs are okay here, but in other places they're not. So never move these guys across state lines. I'll figure out how to make that stop happening. All right, and here's just a side-by-side of the green frog against the bullfrog. Can you tell which is which? Hopefully. I also wanted to show you a side-by-side of the tadpoles. This will not be on your quizzes, but it's just kind of a handy guide to find, where the green frog has spots on the bottom part of the tail and the bullfrog doesn't. With all tadpole identification, you can actually use their what teeth they have, which is what these diagrams are showing. But you have to have a microscope for that. So that's not something we're going to be doing this year. Maybe in future years we'll be doing tadpole ID with microscopes when we're not in a pandemic. But for now, just know that you can look for those spots to ID whichever is which. All right. The next species we're going to talk about is another Lithobates. This is Lithobates sylvatica, and these guys are really easy to ID because they're the only frog around here that has a mask over its eyes. That's what I always call it, but I guess it's really more of like a dark stripe. These guys range from like tan to pink to brown, but they're always going to have this dark brown mask over their eyeballs, and they're much smaller than the green frogs and the bullfrogs. They're more like that size, much more smaller. These guys are also not common in the summer months, so you're much more likely to see them in the spring. That being said, this field season when I was in Wisconsin, we were finding wood frogs all over the place, but normally you only see them during explosive breeding in the spring. Let's listen to what their call sounds like. They're like really silly little ducks, right? They're kind of quacking or barking in the ponds. And you'll often hear hundreds of them at the same time because, again, they're only calling, this is one of the explosive breeders, they're only calling from these pools in the springtime when there are hundreds of them in one place.
Wood frog.
All right, the next frog is the leopard frog. These are also really easy to ID because they look like leopards, right? They have this leopard skin, really noticeable spots. Again, this is a Lithobates, but this species name is Pipiens. The field marks you're going to be looking for are pretty much just these black spots. These are somewhere in between the wood frog size and the green frog size, so they're a little bit bigger. And they're also really big jumpers. These are likely to, they can leap feet at a time, right? So if you're walking through a field of grass or something and something leaps really big, it's probably one of these or a green frog. Let's listen to what they sound like. They're a lot more strained sounding, I think, and a little bit quieter. These guys are not explosive breeders, so you might be hearing just one or two of them calling at a time. All right, the next frog is the cricket frog. Here we're in a different genus. We're in the Acris genus. Acris blanchardi, sometimes called Blanchard's cricket frog also because of that species name. We've switched sizes now. Now we're talking about really small frogs. So I don't know if you're familiar with duckweed, but that's the plant that's actually in this picture. That's those green circles. Those are really, really tiny. So that kind of helps. If you know what size duckweed is, that gives you a sense of scale of this cricket frog. They're about the size of crickets. They're very small. They have a mottled black, brown, or green coloration. They're really variable in what colors they are, but it's always going to be like kind of spotted. Not the well-defined spots of the leopard frog, but look up some of the other pictures of the cricket frogs just so you get a sense of the variation. And these guys, rather than jump away, will often just duck right underneath the water, or they'll freeze solid. And they're so well camouflaged that they're hard to find. You can even tell in this picture that his back looks a lot like some of the muck around him. So let's listen to what they sound like. These are an explosive breeder. You'll hear a lot of them all at once. So I always remember the cricket frog as it sounds like marbles hitting against each other. It's very clingy, very glass sounding.
Northern.
All right. Now this frog is the one that you're not likely to find in water unless it happens to be breeding. These guys are the frogs that you see on maybe your car or on the buildings near water. A lot of people see them on their like sheds, for instance. And these are the gray tree frogs. Now you'll notice this, it says Hyla is the genus, and I have the SP as the species. And that's because there are a couple species of gray tree frogs that live near us, and we're right in the hybrid zone. And I do not expect you to be able to tell the species apart or to be able to tell whether you're working with a hybrid. So I just want you to know the gray tree frog or Hylaspa, and you can just remember that. You don't ever have to know how to tell the different species from each other. These, because they're often found on buildings and such, well, they're often found on buildings and such because they have these enlarged toe pads. So you see the tip of the toes are really rounded that help them grip to surfaces so they can better climb. And they're also really variable in color. Some of them are green, like in this picture, and some of them are much more brown. There's also a few other, I've seen a pink one before. There's some kind of weird variation in there. But notice especially those toe pads and where they're found is often a giveaway. Now I'm gonna play this call, and I bet it's gonna sound familiar to some of you.
Gray tree frog. Hyla versicolor.
So we hear some green frogs in the background. Did you hear that twang? Green frogs again. So I think these guys get mistaken a lot for being bugs, and part of that is because the sounds are clearly coming from the trees often at night. But they're just so commonly heard at night, and they're so loud. The sound really carries. You hear them calling from trees or buildings a lot at night. So if that was familiar to you, now you know you've got tree frogs in that area.
Gray.
The next group of frogs, again, we're just kind of going to lump them all together because it's not really clear. In this case, it's not because they hybridize, it's because there's a lot of arguments among taxonomists about how many species there actually are. So we're just going to call this Pseudacris. These are the chorus frogs. According to iNaturalist, the one that has been most cited around Chicago is the boreal chorus frogs. But again, that doesn't matter. That's just for your fun facts. But what all the chorus frogs have in common is they have this stripe that does go across their eye like a mask, but also keeps going down the body. So unlike the wood frog, where the stripe is like highly contrasting with the body and then stops right there, like a little burglar, the chorus frogs go all the way down. Chorus frogs are often actually more green too than those wood frogs, and they're shaped like a triangle. So they're pretty chubby in the back, pretty pointy nose, and they're also very small. We're talking just a little bit bigger than the cricket frogs, whereas the wood frogs are about that size. So this is another difference that can help you tell them apart. But mostly keep in mind that stripe that goes down the side. This one has a couple stripes. Sometimes they only have the one big one. And they're also really variable in color, from green to brown to kind of a rosy color.
Upland.
Let's listen to them. A multi-note call, right? Where it kind of tapers off. Part of your bioacoustics activity for this week is going to help you come up with ways to remember all these sounds, including visualizing it. So hopefully that'll help if you're feeling overwhelmed right now. The spring peeper, we're back at a really tiny sized frog. These can always be ID'd by an X across their back. So here we're looking at this X. It's sometimes like longer than other times, but we're always going to see this pattern here. They're also really variable in color, and they also will, like the cricket frog, they'll hide or they'll dive when you see them because they rely much more on camouflage than a lot of the other frogs do. Their call is also probably going to be really familiar to you. Let's play it. Not so much that one, but this one especially. Right? Sound like little lasers, some people say. I guess that's most representative.
Spring peeper.
When you hear a lot together, it can be really deafening. This is also kind of the stereotypical noise that TV shows and movies will play to let you know you're in the wilderness. I was just watching Battlestar Galactica the other night, and they had landed on some planet to get algae, and you could hear spring peepers in the background. It's like, really? This planet with totally different evolutionary trajectories happens to have a spring peeper that makes the exact same noise, and yet no game you can hunt? Makes no sense. But the spring peeper is like the noise that the movie industry uses to let you know you're in the wilderness and it's springtime. All right, let's move on to the toads. So I know we've already had one of these sightings this year, which is exciting. This is the American toad, Anaxarus americanus. These are really common in gardens or yards, often far from water. So these guys will also travel back to ponds for breeding, but then they travel far away from the water the rest of the year. They can always be ID'd by these elevated bumps that are all over their bodies, including this big one. This big one is called the parotid gland. And they have them while toads have them while frogs don't. I do want to point out, we're going to talk about the other toad species that's around here called the Fowler's toad. Anaxarus fowleri. You do not have to be able to tell these two apart. And many other areas where they're, in many other parts of their range in the US, you can tell them apart because they don't live in the same area and they have some like well-defined differences. But here in Chicago, we're right at the midst of two zones and they hybridize and it's just nearly impossible to tell them apart. So definitely don't worry about knowing whether something's an Anaxarus fowleri or Anaxarus americanus. Just put Anaxarus americanus or fowleri, right? Know that it's one of those two. The only way that we can reliably tell them apart here is if we hear them, and they have a very short breeding season, so we don't hear them very often. But let's play what that sounds like. This is the American toad, and then the Fowler's toad. There it is. It kind of sounds like something dying, a dying sheep or something, right? So that's the only like reliable way to tell them apart. Again, don't worry about it here, except for telling their calls apart here in the US. You don't have to be able to tell them apart visually. All right, that was all the anurans. So I wanted to take a minute to have you listen to this really cool beat. I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but I just want, you should definitely follow this link. Let's see if we can do it without ads. I forgot to set this up before. There we go. All right, this is really catchy. I definitely recommend you all check out this link. Just to be clear, all those noises are frog calls. So that's just kind of a fun remix of frog calls. They're not all Illinois frogs, but see which of those you can ID, because I'm sure there'll be some that you're going to be familiar with. All right, let's move on to the Urodels. So there are only a few of these, so don't worry. And again, these are only likely to be seen during breeding season. With these species in particular, this one and the next one we're going to talk about, they live underground most of the year. So you really only see them during the breeding season. But this first one is the tiger salamander, Ambystoma tigrinum. You can tell them apart from the next one we're going to talk about, the spotted salamander, because of the belly color. If you can't see the belly that well, you can still see what color's kind of coming up from underneath it. They've got a yellow or a pale belly, and you can look at the lower lip also. And they have these large spots that aren't super rounded. And I'm saying those things because the next species, the spotted salamander, has really round spots and has a gray or blackish belly. So let me just flip back between those two. We have this yellow belly with distorted spots is the tiger salamander. And the rounded spots with the gray belly is the spotted salamander. Again, we're just dealing with one genus, Ambystoma. We're talking about maculatum versus tigrinum. So the tiger salamander or the spotted salamander. Both live most of the year underground, but come out for explosive breeding in the spring. And when I say spring, I mean like really late winter. It's just as the snow is melting. It's still pretty cold out. It's usually when we're getting some rain. They just love to go to those vernal pools. And we talked a little bit about the life cycle. You don't have to be able to ID the larva, but I did want to show you an example of what that looks like. So here's a spotted salamander larva. You can see it's got some of the spots already, and it has these external gills. The tiger salamander gets larger than the spotted salamander. So if you have like a really big salamander, it's probably the tiger, whereas spotteds tend to be skinnier too and smaller. This next species is really easily ID'd, which is nice. It's the blue spotted salamander. This is the only one with blue on it, Ambystoma laterale. It's also smaller than the spotted salamander, but you can always tell it because it's going to have some blue spots on it. There are some morphs that only have like 2 or 3 spots. Those are still blue spotted salamanders if they're blue. So that's one way to tell them apart. Blue spotted salamanders are much more common than the spotted salamanders around here. I do some work with spotted salamanders, and it's been really hard to find populations. So actually, if you know of any around here, please let me know, because my lab would like to study them next spring. The blue spotteds are fairly common. There's a lot of people doing work on those populations around here. All right, this next one, this next Urodel is really fascinating because it is so different from the ones we just talked about. So this is the eastern newt. We're talking about a different genus, Notophthalmus viridescens. These guys actually have a totally extra stage of their life cycle. So like the other ones, they have a larva. Here's the larva form. It's got those external gills. Then this is the terrestrial form, but it's actually a subadult. It's not yet reproductive. And we call this stage an eft. So they're bright orange, really easily ID'd. It's the only bright orange thing around here, right? So this is an eastern newt eft. This means it's lost its gills. It comes up on land. It's fully terrestrial. It's also really toxic. So anything that eats it is likely to get sick. It can't hurt you, but you're more likely to hurt it because of the oils on your skin. And then after this has been on land for a while, it actually goes back to water. It grows a long flat tail again and becomes fully aquatic. So this is actually the reproductive adult stage of the newt. You can see it's still got some of those red spots like it did as an eft, but it's definitely not as orange anymore. We've got a yellow belly. Some of them are red-bellied, but it's a distinctly different form. So be able to tell what stage and what species we're talking about with the eastern newt. You don't have to worry so much about the larva, about IDing the larva, but be able to tell whether something's an eft or an adult of the eastern newt, because they have some things in common, but otherwise they look different. So these guys have to be underwater all the time. The efts are fully terrestrial. All right, the last main species that we have here in Chicago is the mud puppy. These guys are incredibly fast and they're fully aquatic. So they actually do not have a terrestrial stage at all. So we've now had one species that has an extra stage, and now we have another species that has one less stage. So this stays aquatic its whole life. This is a condition called neoteny. Neo meaning new. So they have permanent larval characteristics. They always keep those external gills. They're pretty bland colored. They're usually a dark brown or a tan brown, and some of them have stripes, some of them have spots, but they're pretty uniform. They have these kind of flattened faces, flattened noses, and then they have the external gills. So in this picture, this one does have gills. They're just laid flat against the body. So don't let that trick you in other ones. Use these field marks, and also you can rule out the other species if you're trying to ID something in Chicagoland. I just wanted to bring the species to your attention. It is not here in Chicagoland, though it is in Southern Illinois, but it is I think it's a threatened species in Illinois. This is called the hellbender. And these guys are really cool. They look a little bit like the mud puppy. They're really well adapted to a fully aquatic lifestyle. They're pretty flat, so they hang out where there's lots of rocks. But let me show you something really cool about these guys is their size. These guys are huge. They can get really big. And partially because of how big they are, they need to be able to exchange so much oxygen to survive. They always live in fast flowing creeks and rivers, and they're really prone to any sort of contamination. So if you have a hellbender in your stream, you have a really clean and clear stream. So there's been a lot of conservation efforts to help bring these back to other parts of Illinois, but they're so prone to pollution, it's hard. And they're also really secretive because they camouflage so well with the river and stream bottoms, and because they just kind of stay in one place their whole life underneath those rocks. Okay, so those were all the amphibians plus an extra bonus hellbender that you're likely to see in Chicagoland. And I wanted to give you just 2 more species of birds to study because there's just no way we could get all the songbirds in 1 week. But here's just 2 more that you may have already been familiar with, and I know some people in this class have already spotted. So the first is the mourning dove. So these are usually a light brown color. They have a tapered tail when they fly. It's longer than like a lot of the other birds we've talked about, a little bit longer, and it comes to a point. They also have no iridescence. and that's important to distinguish them from the pigeons, which look kind of similar. And they only call in the morning or the daytime. You're probably already familiar with their call, but I'm going to play it here. There it is. Right, so to non-birders, these sometimes get mistaken for owl calls because it's kind of hooty, but you're never going to hear these guys at nighttime. And once you hear it a few times, you get really used to telling whether something's a dove or not. But this is the mourning dove, Zenaida macrora. And then the nenext species I just wanted to talk about is the American goldfinch. I know you've had some classmates who have spotted these guys. So they can be really easily ID'd by because they're bright yellow and they have black. We're looking at a female on the left and a male on the right, so these are sexually dimorphic. And let's listen to their really pretty songs. All right, so study up on those guys, study up on the frog calls, the bird calls, the species names, and good luck on your species quiz next week.